Sure. Okay. Mhm. Say no. Where's the? Thank you. Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. We're gonna get ready to start, but before we start, there will be pictures taken. So if you don't want your picture taken, just raise your hand and where is Leslie will document, okay? Okay, cool. So, hi, my name is Daiki Garel. I use she, her pronouns. I am the digital and data literacy librarian here at the Heritage, here at the MLK Library. And I am also the lead for data services. And today is a very special edition of the workshop that I'll be giving more often, which is a critical data visualization workshop. Today, we're going to be having a talk added onto it, which is going to be about slavery, data, and information. Okay. Okay. So every day we encounter data that shapes our lives. Credit score determines where we can live. We have risk assessments shape who gets policed. Algorithms sort job applications before human eyes ever see them. Health metrics define what wellness means down to our sleep cycles and step counts. These feel neutral. These feel like neutral tools, efficient, objective, modern. They are not. What I want to argue today, and what a lot of scholars have argued, is that drawing on these scholars, three scholars in particular, I want to talk about the intersection between critical race theory and Black studies, and that data practices are inherited forms. The ways we collect, categorize, calculate, and make decisions based on numbers were forged in specific historical conditions, the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery in particular. We are not simply using data that has been applied in racist ways. We are using data forms, ways of turning life into information that were invented through the reduction of Black life to fungible, calculable, surveillable units. But I want to do more than trace history today. I want to think about how we live inside that history. The scholar Sadia Hartman writes about the afterlife of slavery, the ways that emancipation did not end slavery structuring power, but transformed it. For Hartman, the afterlife is not a metaphor, it is a material, the continued vulnerability of Black life to premature death, the continued extraction of value from Black bodies, the continued production of Black life as the position against which humanity is defined. I want to suggest that our data practices are one site where this afterlife is most acute and most difficult to see because numbers appear to operate without history. The scholar Frantz Fanon, writing in 1952 about the colonial subject, described a moment when a white child points at him and says, "Look, a Negro." In that moment, Fanon writes, his body was given back to him, sprawled out, distorted, recolored, clad in mourning. He calls this epidermalization, the collapse. Hold on, my bad. The collapse of his entire being into the surface of his skin, the reduction of his subjectivity to a legible, calculable, knowable Blackness. What Fanon diagnosed in that specific encounter, what Hartman traces in the post-emancipation United States, I want to argue is operationalized in our data systems. The ledger, the database, the algorithm, they are technologies of epidermalization. They reduce being to surface, to numbers, to readable. They produce what Hartman calls the afterlife, not as memory, but as infrastructure. Today, we move through three scholars. Each takes a specific data from the slavery archive, traces afterlife into our present, and traces afterlife into our present. Hortense Spillers and the ledger, Katherine McKittrick and the insurance claim, Simone Browne and the biometric brand. Each asks not just what happened, but what can we know through these forms and what do they make unknowable? And each I will suggest offers resources for refusing the afterlife that Hartman describes and that epidermalization that Frantz Fanon theorizes. Okay, so we're getting into the bulk of it. If you do need to, take a couple minutes, it's going to be some heavy stuff. We're going to talk about some really heavy stuff. I would do it a disservice during these particular political times for me not to talk about the larger histories of violence in this country. So for this particular slide, I want to bring us to the attention of Hortense Spillers and the ledger. The transatlantic slave ship kept detailed records, not diaries, not ethnographies, ledgers, columns of numbers, quantities, 50 men, 30 women, 20 children, price value assigned per unit, mortality rates, losses at sea calculated as depreciation insurance valuations, human life rendered as calculable risk, financial instrument applied to person. Spiller's intervention is to read this document not as evidence of greed or cruelty. Through it is both, but as an epistemological technology, a way of knowing. The ledger made it possible to speak about human beings in specific ways, as interchangeable, as calculable, as reducible to geometry and price. It creates what she calls a specific epistemology, the form of data that shapes what can be known, rendering certain things saleable while making others disappear. Here is where Hartman becomes essential to understanding Spiller's project. Hartman writes in Venues in 2 acts about the violence of the archive, the way that documents of slavery produced by enslavers can only capture Black life through grammar or property. She practices what she calls critical fabulation, reading against the grain, imagining what the archive cannot say, refusing to let the ledger have the last word. Spillers is doing related but distinct work. She is not primarily trying to recover the interior lives of the enslaved, though she honors that project. She is analyzing the structure of the ledger itself. How does it work? What does it assume? What kind of world does it make possible? The ledger Spillers shows us is where Hartman's afterlife begins. The forms invented there, the fungibility of Black life, and we're going to get into that term a little later because it's a very important term. Where am I? Of Black life, the reduction of kinship to cargo, the rendering of death as loss, do not end with emancipation. They are transferred. They become the forms of modern data today. So the next slide here specifically talks about the grammar of the cell. To understand the ledger, we have to understand the hold. Spillers identifies 3 operations that the ship's grammar performed on human bodies. Standardization. The ship's hold was geometrically organized to maximize cargo capacity. Individual bodies distinct in height, health, history, weight, had to be rendered as interchangeable volumes, measured, fitted, stacked. The body becomes a unit of space, not a person. Abstraction is the second one. Names, kinships, language, histories, all particularly erased, replaced by categories, men, women, children. Although I would personally argue that enslaved folks weren't identified as children or human beings, so therefore humanity can't necessarily be allowed to them, or woman or manhood or childhood can't be applied in the same ways that someone who was identified as human being could. Identity becomes category, life becomes data point. The ledger could not record that this unit was a Yoruba speaker who had left a child behind. It required abstraction. Calculability is the third and final. The loss of one offset by the value of others, mathematical equivalence, one unit equals one another. This is fungibility, Spiller's key concept here. The production of data that treats distinct persons as mutually replaceable units. Persons become mutually replaceable. I want to bring in Fanon, Frantz Fanon, into direct conversation. Fanon writes about the corporal I always get this word wrong. Maldiction. The way black skin becomes the site of all meaning, the surface that speaks before the subject can. Spiller's analysis of the hold shows us the historical production of the condition. The hold is where the body becomes pure surface, where epidermalization is institutionalized. Epidermalization is a term that was specifically brought up by Frantz Fanon and created and invented by Frantz Fanon to describe when one's value, status, meaning is dedicated to the epidermal, the body, the skin in particular. Where am I? The geometry of the cell, the abstraction of the category, the calculability of fungibility, all reduced being to the body as measurable, visible, knowable objects. Fanon experiences this in the colonial encounter. Spiller shows us its genealogy. The child who points at Fanon is activating a grammar invented in that hold. This is not merely dehumanization, Spillers insists. It is a systematic data practice that requires specific forms of knowledge and governance. The next slide is specifically going to be about the data afterlives and the persistence of fungibility. The ledger's grammar persists. Spiller's concept of fungibility does not stay on the ship, it travels. Credit scoring, financial history reduced to 3-digit fungibility. 720 equals another 720 score. The score replaces the story. The ledger's grammar, quantification leads to equivalence, leads to replacement, right? So if you are trying to rent an apartment and your credit score does not suffice, they will replace you with somebody else whose credit score does. Whether or not you become homeless because of it is beyond them. They're not interested in those particular types of stories. Predictive policing, populations aggregated into risk profiles. Individual particularity disappears into categorical threat. The ledger's grammar abstraction leads to categorization, leads to risk calculation. Algorithmic hiring, candidates as interchangeable data points ranked by fit, a metric that renders persons comparable and replaceable. The ledger's grammar measurement leads to ranking, leads to selection. This innovation of the slave ship was not cruelty. It was the systematic production of data that made persons into units, into numbers. We have not escaped this form. We have automated it. Fanon helps us see what is at stake existentially. The reduction to fungibility is not merely economic. It produces what Fanons call overdetermined subjects. The person who is fixed by gaze, who cannot escape being for others, whose being is given back to them as an object. The credit score, the risk profile, the algorithmic rank, these are contemporary forms of overdetermination. They fix the subject in advance. They are technologies of epidermalization operationalized in today's world. The next slide. So here we're going to move on to Katherine McKittrick, the data event, the Zong insurance claim. Now this one is interesting. It's interesting for a few reasons, but I think you'll see why. Spiller shows us the data form here. Katherine McKittrick asks us to look at what happens when that form encounters crisis. When the data meets something it cannot account for, yet must account for. In 1781, the British slave ship Zong sailed from Africa to Jamaica. It carried 442 enslaved people. It ran low on water. The captain, Luke Collingwood, ordered 132 people be thrown overboard. Drowning, sharks. The calculation was economic. Dead cargo lost at sea was covered under insurance. Dead from natural causes, starvation, thirst was not. The massacre generated a data set, 132 persons thrown overboard, 30, I guess, would be considered like 30-year-old calculated value per unit, precise numbers, clear valuation, legally admissible. The owners filed for insurance. The case went to court. The legal question was not, did murder occur? It was the jettison necessary per insurance term? The court debated accounting, not murder. The data form rendered mass murder as an insurance dispute, not as the taking of human life. McKittrick's intervention is to refuse the frame. She does not ask, was the data accurate? She asks, what does it mean that accurate data can render murder as question of calculation? This is not bad data. It is exemplary data, actually, precise, well-documented, legally admissible, replicable. The violence is in the form of knowledge itself, which can render murder as a question of calculation. Good data, precise, documented, legally sound, replicable, hides suffering, agency, resistance, the act of murder itself. This is where McKittrick enters into explicit dialogue with Hartman. Hartman in Venus in 2 acts refuses to let the archive of the Zong, the legal documents, the insurance records stand as the only story. She writes, I wanted to fill in the silence, to give voice to the void, to represent what had been impossible to represent. McKittrick takes this further. She asks, what if the refusal to represent, the maintenance of silence, of imprecision, of the uncounted, is it itself a form of knowledge? What if good measure is the problem, not the solution? I'm hot. So McKittrick theorizes alternative data practices. She calls them bad measure, not because they are inaccurate, but because they refuse the demand for precision, extraction, and closure. The uncounted, what the ledger excludes, the song in the whole, the relationship between captives, the refusal to be measured, knowledge that escapes quantification, the relational, knowledge that requires duration, presence, change, a groove, a friendship, a story that cannot be fixed, knowledge that emerges through relationship, not extraction. The imprecise, maintaining openness, wonder, curiosity, resisting the rush to classification, knowledge that refuses closure. Here, McKittrick draws on Sylvia Winters, which is one of my favorite scholars. Concept of demonic grounds, epistemologies that emerge from the position of the excluded. For Winters, as for Fanon, the demonic is not evil. It is the position those who have been made non-human by the dominant order and who therefore can see that order's limits. McKittrick's bad measure is demonic in the sense it emerges from the recognition that good measure, the Zong ledger, the contemporary database, is already violent. Fanon is relevant here in a different register. Fanon ends Black Skin, White Mask, which is a book that he wrote and is one of the canonical texts in Black studies. with a call for a new humanism, not the European humanism that built on excluding the native, but one forged through anti-colonial struggle. McKittrick's Bad Measure is a contribution to this project. It asks, what would knowledge look like if it did not require the reduction of the other to object? If it did not require the fixity that Fanon diagnoses? What would disalienation feel like as a data practice? Simone Browne. We move on to Simone Browne, another one of my favorite scholars, brilliant scholar, in her understanding of data technologies. Simone Browne takes us from the ledger and the insurance claim to the body itself as data. She traces 4 technologies from slavery archive that we would now call biometric. The brand, the runaway notice, the lantern law, and the population registry. Branding, which is flesh as permanent data storage. The body becomes a readable text, identified, inscribed in the skin. Biometric identification, the body as a type of data carrier. Runaway notices, physical descriptions as searchable databases, 5'8", scar on left cheek, speak English, and Wolof. Aggregated personal data for tracking and identification, the body as queryable, as a queryable data set. Lantern laws, which she talks about in her first 2 chapters. Physical description as searchable databases. Hold on. Lantern laws, the body requires to generate data required to carry light to be legible to power, mandatory data generation, visibility as obligation. The Book of Negroes is the 4th and final one, 3,000 entries, a population database, name, description, former owner, quality, age, health, skill, comprehensive data collection for population management, similar to statistics and its origins of statistics. The census as control, data for governance. These were data systems. They collected, stored, retrieved, and acted upon bodily information. Each persists updated for the digital age. Browne's work is mostly explicit in conversation with Fanon, almost exclusively. Her chapter, Branding Blackness, takes Fanon's epidermalization as its theoretical frame and asks, how is this operationalized? How is the reduction of being to skin surface mechanized, scaled, and automated? Let me go on to the next one. Okay. So this one specifically talks about biometric and then and now. So it maps it during slavery and then to present day. Browne establishes genealogical continuity, not mere analogy. Here on this slide, you'll see that there is the slave data system that I outlined here for us: branding, runaway notices, lantern laws, the Book of Negroes, which we just went over. The function permanent for branding was permanent bodily identification. For runaway notices, aggregated personal data for tracking. Lantern laws, compulsory data generation, and the Book of Negroes, population management, scoring, and sorting. The contemporary forms of these things could look like facial recognition for branding and fingerprinting. Runaway notices in the contemporary were more digital profiles, background checks. Lantern laws, street cameras, phone location. The Book of Negroes, government and commercial databases. These systems persist. They are not an analogy. They are genealogically connected. The same logics of bodily identification, tracking, compulsory visibility, and population management that emerged under slavery have been technologically amplified, not fundamentally transformed. Fanon's overdetermination is the theoretical key here. The runaway notice overdetermines the enslaved person from without. Their identity is fixed by the description, their possible futures constrained by the networks of readers. There is no outside this data. The notice creates the fugitive as known, wanted, fixed in place, even in flight. Contemporary digital profiles function identically. The body rendered as information compiled for surveillance, the subject fixed before they encounter the gaze. The afterlife, Hartman reminds us, is not repetition, but transformation. Who do, who do not have lantern laws on the books? We have terms of service agreements. The compulsion is not legal, but economic and social. Participate in data extraction or be excluded from employment, communication, mobility. Epidermalization becomes the price of admission to modern life. I'm sweating boots. So this one is talking about racializing function. Here's Browne's critical intervention. Developed an explicit dialogue with Fanon. These technologies do not apply universally. They target, they emerge from and return to the surveillance of Blackness. Fanon writes, the Black man has, and he's very gendered in his speech, where he shouldn't be, but, you know, older scholars are something else, you know. The Black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. This is not a psychological observation. It's a structured one. The colonial order, and Browne adds, the slavery archive, requires Blackness as the position of absolute visibility, absolute knowability, absolute availability to power. Facial recognition is the second. Higher error rates for darker skin, but also trained on data sets that overrepresent Black mugshots, reproducing the assumption that Blackness is the proper object of surveillance. The technology inherits the racial gaze. The error is not technical, it is genealogical. The system works as designed when it misrecognizes Black faces because it was designed in a tradition that required Black overdetermination. Predictive policing, risk calculated from historical arrest data that reflects historical overpolicing. The data predicts what the police have already done and calls it objective. Past racialized policing becomes the ground truth for future policing. Fanon's crushing objecthood is operationalized and algorithmically scored. Credit scoring, objective numbers that reproduce racial wealth gaps because the inputs, employment history, property ownership, loan history, are themselves racialized. Structural racism becomes individual risk. The score appears neutral while encoding history. The data is racist, not because it is biased in a technical sense. It is racist because it inherits and operationalizes the racializing function of its genealogical precursors. The brand, the runaway notice, the lantern law, the Book of Negroes. These were not neutral tools misapplied. They were specifically designed to surveil Blackness. Their afterlives continue the work. The same bodies made most legible under slavery are most surveilled today. Okay, so this one is synthesis. Let me gather these threads together for you, and obviously have some good questions later. The genealogical method, each scholar traces how slavery's data forms persist in contemporary systems, not as metaphor, but as inherited practice. The question is not, are these systems racist, but rather, do they operationalize the racializing logics of their historical precursors? Hartman's afterlife is the frame. These are not bad applications of neutral tools. They are continuations of slavery's ways of knowing, transforming, but not transcended. Fanon's epidermalization is the mechanism the reduction of being to surface, to data, to readable, which these scholars show us is historically specific to governance of Blackness. Okay. These scholars do not ask, how do we fix the data? They do not ask, how do we remove bias from inherited systems? They ask, what forms of life become possible and impossible through these data practices, and what alternatives exist? This shifts the focus from technical correction to epistemological transformation. The ledger, the insurance claim, the brand, these were not natural or neutral tools misused. They were specific ways of knowing that required specific ways of being. To inherit them is to inherit their conditions of possibility. Each data from form enables certain worlds while foreclosing others. Fungibility enables mass management, efficiency, exchange, fungibility, foreclosures, particularity, relationships, what is that? Irreplaceability, spillers. Um, good data in, good data enables precision, prediction, control. Good data forecloses ambiguity, wonder, the unmeasurable, McKittrick. Biometric data enables identification, tracking, governance. Biometric data, foreclosure, opacity, forecloses opacity, refusal, the right to be unknown, Browne. The critical question is not how to improve these forms, but whether we can imagine other forms, and whether we can recognize the creativity, the knowledge, the survival that already exist in the bad measure, the surveillance, the refusal. Hartman's afterlife is not just suffering, it is also creative refusal. Fanon's disalienation is not just critique, it is also the demand for something new, to think beyond the physical epidermal. Questions for continued inquiry. I want to leave you with 4 provocations for our discussion. On method, um, how do we read data against the grain, finding in data sets the evidence of what they exclude? Hartman's practices, critical fabulation, to fill the archive silence. What stories do the silences in contemporary data tell us? On fairness, if algorithmic fairness is archived by correcting for bias inherited data forms, do we preserve the form themselves, the fungibility, the overdetermination, the epidermalization? What do spillers teach us about the persistence of these grammars, even when the bias is removed? On refusal, McKittrick and Browne both suggest that not all knowledge requires extraction. Fanon calls for disalienation, the restoration of being beyond the gaze. Where do we see effective refusal of datification, refusal to be counted, sorted, made legible? What are its costs and possibilities? On your data, you generate data constantly. Which of your daily practices inherit the ledger? Which inherit McKittrick's bad measure? Which activate Browne's biometric branding? What alternatives do you practice? The question is not how to improve the data, but how to imagine other ways of knowing. Thank you. Oh, for anyone in person who would like to speak, please wait until a mic is handed to you. Questions? Thank you for the claps online. I'm hot and nervous. Contemplations, thoughts. Mm-hmm. A lot of data and information. Okay, okay.
First of all, I want to thank you so much for this presentation. This is great, really thought-provoking. And I'm just wondering, thinking about your question, like what are these other ways of knowing? Because I think you encompass so many types of data that we see every day or use every day that we're so used to. Are there other types of knowing that you're thinking about or that these scholars are thinking about just to get us started and thinking? I can't even begin to think about these other ways of knowing because we're so this data collection that you're talking about derived from slavery is so encompassing to our life. It's hard to think outside of that. So I'm wondering what you're thinking outside of that.
I'm thinking of many things. But one of them that I will name is embracing imprecision, embracing the embracing knowledge that goes beyond technology. I think reconnecting with the person, reconnecting with the individual, understanding that technologies and information and data and all these things have always been, technically you can argue that there's lots of types of data that has existed throughout history, but the way in which we understand and perceive and gather information today is very meticulous and very fixated on the genealogies of enslavement. And so I would say, talk to a friend instead of getting, instead of build relationships, instead of, having technology do all the work for building relationships for you. I don't want to sound, because I'm not that old, but um, but when I was a kid, we went outside, we touched grass, we engaged with the neighborhood peoples. We had conversations in person. It wasn't necessarily fixed to online, although I loved MySpace. It was not fixed to all those things. And I think universities have a very specific, and libraries have a very unique, I think, interjection there. I think because at universities, you're always walking around and seeing people. It's easy to say hello to someone. It's easy to develop a relationship with someone. It's easy to understand that person outside of a data point in some census somewhere, or understand somebody in some weird data set that the government has made up about a population of people. You can engage with people directly and get to know their individual stories, get to know their individual, interests and in loves and loss and all these things that make a human being a human being. Listen, I know I'm a data scientist, I'm a data librarian, I'm a technologist at heart, and also it could be too much. It could be too much. Oh,
I have a comment from online. This is from Ryan Esquino. Great talk, lots to think about.
oh, awesome. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
So, anyways, if I may ask correctly, so let me ask clearly. So, where do you find out that racism is uh, like racism is not biased, but like I don't remember, but like it's coming through the data or something like that. If I heard it correctly.
Mm-hmm. So your question is, how do we understand that data is not racist or data is not biased?
Something like that, yes.
Okay. So data. Oh, thank you. So data in and of itself, it can operate from many different ways. Bias is not an accurate portrayal of what racist data does to people. you know um Data can strip an entire community of their resources, of their access to a proper education, a proper funding for a school, a proper thing. It can be the reason why you have a grocery store like Whole Foods in a community versus a McDonald's, on every corner. It's the food deserts that exist everywhere. It's the water insecurity. We saw that with Flint, Michigan, and the data and information on the chemicals in their water that was placed there by either government or corporate a while ago. And even from the place where I grew up in central or born in central California or Central Valley, Delano, there was we could not drink the water. Child, I wouldn't drink that water to save my life. I would literally, my mom would literally walk a while to get buckets of water so that we can drink it at home or boil it on the stove for a period of time. It's just like but data about information like that goes beyond a simple bias. It actually engages with people's lives. It's not a bias whatsoever. I agree with Simone Browne around data being racist, because the origins of it is, and the people who create it, understand it, and even all of us, we exist in the world where that is the data we know. That is the data that are trained us. It's hard to think outside the box when you're in it. I think you had mentioned something like that earlier, Christina. It's hard to it's hard to do that. But it's imperative that we do. It's imperative that we work together to do that. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Any other?
A little bit though.
A little. I'm sorry. I'll try to do better next time. Okay.
So this question is saying, Daiki, are you saying that there's other ways of knowing that are more qualitative than quantitative?
That's a way, yes. There is more ways of knowing even outside of qualitative data and information. I'm thinking about um what did they call it? I think it was called a Jami script in West Africa. It was the Dahomey people. They have these things called the Timbuktu manuscripts where they document large amounts of astronomical knowledge using a script that was given to them by older civilizations a while ago, because they were spoken languages, not necessarily written ones. And so that archive was placed actually into UNESCO very recently, maybe like in the last 20 years, had tried to go there and try to dig them up out of the dirt, out of the sand, which preserved their legacies and their history. But in those documents, UNESCO wanted to digitize them, but in those documents held a lot of knowledge about the Dahomeys history, about them and the cosmos, the stars. And I think like that way of knowing was very different. It was around fires, it was around community members. It was different. It was knowledge that was shared, knowledge that was observed, practiced, and given down to children in ways that wasn't so fungible. It was important that you couldn't lose that. That's not replaceable, you know. Mhm.
So both comment and question.
Okay.
I do work supporting vulnerable communities, domestic violence survivors, BIPOC folks, LGBTQ plus, housing insecure, etc. What strategies can I implement on my team that decenter whiteness or white frameworks in data collection and data reporting?
My God, today. Um, there's so many things I think there. Um, I think that in terms of incorporating like ethical data practices, I think it would be really important to partner specifically and directly with community members and community organizers who are already doing that work, which there are plenty. There's an organization outside of Mississippi, Jackson, who deal a lot with data and information on housing insecurity, who look at individual data points within the larger data in order to understand who they are as people and help them individually. So I would suggest reaching out to folks in the community that you're working with, whether that is domestic violence survivors, whether that's vulnerable populations racially, in terms of sexuality, et cetera, and ask them like, what are the things that they need more so than how can you implement a data practice? Yes.
Another question from online. Can you speak to the relationship between compulsive visibility, surveillance, and the orientation in library and info science towards open access as the aspirational paradigm?
That was a lot. Thank you. It's a good question. Can you read it again?
Can you speak to the relationship between compulsive visibility, surveillance, and the orientation in library and info science towards open access as the aspirational paradigm?
Okay, so I'll first talk about compulsive visibility and surveillance. So one of the distinctions I want to make that critical race theory and Black studies are more specifically Afro-pessimism, which is a world of thought, make is that critical race theory was originally a legal practice. It was a legal tool to understand how racism, how violence gets passed down through laws and become legible on the population. Most of that language was utilized to create the DEI initiatives that we see today. And DEI is very important. It serves such a great thing for many people. But what Black studies critiques about what it means to be visible is that basically you want to be visible within what structure, within what society? A society that murders and kills. And I mean, I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but there's a book called The Delectable Negro that maps a history of the consumption of Black people by white folks. You know, is that the society you want to be visible in? Or do you want to be visible in a world that articulates a non-European understanding of humanity and roots itself in the decolonial practices, the movement practices, the communal practices? And so Black studies, I think, broadens the conversation about mapping laws that affects people's lives into how do we start to create a life worth living, you know? So there's that question. And then you talked about information science. Read that second part. Thank you. Thank you.
Orientation in library and info science towards open access as the aspirational paradigm.
I'm okay. Read it one more time. I want to get it right.
Orientation in library and info science towards open access as the aspirational paradigm.
I think okay, thank you so much for that second piece too. So I think the purpose of open access is that knowledge isn't held behind an ivory tower or held against people that talks about those same people, right? And so open access, whether that be open access to research, open access to data, open access to digital tools, etc., it's important in the sense that it allows everyone to utilize them, to understand them, to read them, to engage with them. But when in info science, I feel like as a scholar, I have to argue for it. But like, I think libraries hold a very unique place, for things to exist, for open access to exist, for community sharing to exist, for because I mean, it's always been that with a grain of salt. It's because I mean, and I can't get into that's a long history too. But yes, there's a lot of benefits to open access knowledge, period. I think that it also highlights a potential. I mean, it's open access to everyone. It's open access to police officers. It's open access to government agents and government officials. It's not necessarily something that is held behind a paywall anymore. Granted, they have their own data and information and technologies to collect those things, but I do think that it opens up the world in more ways than one. And I hope I answered your question. Any other question? Period. Any other questions? I know somebody had their hand. Did somebody?
In previous classes that I've taken, I've heard that mass incarceration that happens today is compared to slavery that happened in the United States before. Do you know of any ways that, is there any similarities in how we collect data in prisons and how data used to be collected from enslaved people?
So the slave ledger was one during slavery. There was wanted posters that were pasted around everywhere, and I think the Library of Congress still has some of them in archive that was utilized as information and data to map and target and trace people, locate them in prisons. And so one, yes, the 13th Amendment extends slavery into a person who commits a crime and is duly convicted within the United States. And so, you know, one of the larger conversations there is, did slavery ever end? And Black studies scholars would say no, you know, that there's a lot of logics around it, disappearing people without no one noticing and no one caring. Like in 2018, the Ole Miss, which is a flagship university in Mississippi, their law center developed an archive of all the inmates that were in prisons or tried to collect them. But prior to 2018, it was completely legal to not report on who was in Mississippi jails. You know, you didn't have to report on who was in them. So when their Supreme Court passed laws that said, no, you have to, the data sets, which I've worked with personally, were completely in disarray, so different. There was no structure, there was no format. It was hard to understand them. And so, and I know I critique clean data, but my God, was it hard to clean that, you know? It displayed people's entire information publicly online, which was addresses, phone numbers, all those things. There was no work done to protect the individuals there. They only obtained the knowledge of prisoners and incarcerated people. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. This concludes the live stream portion of the event. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.